Hello and welcome to the second session of the TS2 SMB Azure Bootcamp. I'm Michael Copps, Partner Technology Strategist for the TS2 team, and I'm part of the SMB&D organization that stands for Small and Mid-Sized Business and Distribution.
Yep, and my name is Todd Sweetser, also a Partner Technology Strategist on the TS2 team.
So if you look at our agenda today, we are going to be discussing infrastructure as a service, specifically virtual networks and virtual machines. And Todd will be covering a majority of the content. Let me ask you, Todd, what specifically have you seen out there from partners regarding questions, comments, feedback around virtual machines, virtual networks? I would think it's pretty simple to set up a virtual machine, especially for partners that are familiar with virtualization already.
Yeah, it's definitely simple to spin one up, but it's not necessarily the only thing that needs to be done, and that's probably where the confusion lies. If you're going to be using it in a manner that's going to be integrating with other networks and so on, there's going to be a virtual network involved. And there may be more than one virtual machine participating in that virtual network, right? And then there's a lot of other terms that people may not be familiar with, affinity groups, availability sets, and we'll get into all of that today.
Are there common problems or pitfalls that come up every time? I mean, I know you've been talking to partners a lot about
even
this
pitfalls
stuff
that I ran into, especially in the early days starting to work with this stuff, but it really involves around, I'm just going to spin up a virtual machine and start working. You can do that, but then that virtual machine is going to be completely isolated. There's no way to have it join a virtual network or to participate in the customer's network. And that's why this session talks about both virtual networks and virtual machines, the importance of them working together to produce the final result. You know what, with that, I think we should just get started. As Mike mentioned, this is session 2, Tech Dive. We're going to be talking about extending the network with Microsoft Azure with the services. We're going to be talking about virtual networks at the beginning, make sure everybody has an understanding of the options that are associated with virtual networks and some of the terms associated with it. We'll also, of course, talk about virtual machines and what a lot of the options are there. There's a lot of terminology I mentioned in infrastructure as a service, so one thing we want to make sure everybody knows up front is that the different terminology, where it fits, and so you understand when you start talking to customers and figuring out what those architectures need to look like. And then a good amount of this session will actually be a demonstration. I will go through and show the steps to actually create a virtual network, and then actually show a finished up and running virtual network. And just so everybody knows, for those that saw session 1, where Mike demonstrated the RDS app, the remote desktop applications and the infrastructure we set up, that's what this virtual network that we're going to be showing, the finished product that we've developed for these sessions, that's where it's going to be coming from. And then talk a lot about some next steps and resources. So, Azure Virtual Networks. Really, what is an Azure Virtual Network? I mean, everybody understands what a virtual network is. It is a private network, a closed-loop network that's within the Azure environment. What this affords is that customers can now have virtual machines and technology running up in the Azure environment and have it talk to their local environment directly and not interfering with any other environments that are running within the Azure. It is specific to that customer and how they have it set up. So it's a logical isolation of that network. You can create subnets, you can have private IP addresses, you have a lot of control, and you can also bring your own DNS, domain name service. You can use ours, and I'll show you how you can do that, but you can also, many times you've got Active Directory set up, you've already got DNS set up, of course it'll take advantage and use that DNS service. So there's a few different types of virtual networks in Azure. And when I say types, I'm more talking about topologies. The first one in the upper left-hand corner, you'll see site-to-site VPN. And this is really just that. It's a direct connection between your on-premises infrastructure and an Azure virtual network environment. And it's a dedicated connection, a VPN connection. You set up the gateway in Azure, which we'll walk through in a little bit when we go through the demonstration, and then configure it to connect to your on-premises gateway, some type of router, some type of device that's actually managing that connection on your premises. And then they're able to talk to each other, work with each other, just like they're all one large network. Another way of connecting users into the Azure Virtual Network is via point-to-site, and that's mentioned on the lower part of this slide. Point-to-site is just what you would expect with that term, right? You're actually, from any point, any machine, a particular workstation can connect directly into the Azure Virtual Network using a VPN client that you install. Azure, the virtual network infrastructure, will provide that VPN client. After everything is configured, you would just push out that VPN client and have it install on those workstations, and then they connect directly up into the Azure Virtual Network from wherever they are without having to go through your on-premises network. So it alleviates that one extra step.
So Todd, this brings up something I hear from partners all the time. They understand they have a VPN option of site-to-site, point-to-site. What about other technologies like direct access or something like that?
Good question.
What's that have to do with these VPN connections?
Well, these VPNs are not direct access. Direct access is actually not a supported workload in Azure currently. So it's not something that's even an option. Even if you install servers into the Azure infrastructure, you cannot enable direct access. So for customers that want to have their users connect up into the Azure infrastructure, into that virtual network, this is the way to go right now. A few other scenarios and a few other topologies that have come to be recently. Mike actually mentioned during session 1 about some of the announcements at TechEd. And this is one of them. The next couple of them are a couple of the recent announcements. Multi-site-to-site virtual networking. So this kind of takes the site-to-site to the next level. With site-to-site and the way that it used to work, Azure could not be the hub, it could only be a spoke. Now Azure could actually be the hub between multiple networks, meaning you can connect to more than one on-premises infrastructure at any one time. I believe it's up to 10 that they can connect to at any one time. So if you're talking about many SMB organizations that have small branch offices, but still have an on-premises infrastructure at those branch offices, each one of them can connect them into the same Azure Virtual Network independently of each other, which is a huge new value add. And then another aspect, which is quite exciting, is actually VNet to VNet, virtual network to virtual network. So in this simple graphic, it actually shows two virtual networks in Azure connected to each other. One thing it doesn't really show is where those virtual networks may be in Azure. And what we can do now is if you are even a small customer, as SMB customers, we do have international SMB customers that have presences in other parts of the world, in Europe, in Asia, and so on. They can have an Azure infrastructure that's within their region, right? You can have the one on the left be in the US, one on the right be in Asia Pacific. And those can actually talk to their customers that are, or their users that are within those environments. But then they can actually connect directly to each other using our Microsoft's infrastructure within our data center infrastructure and the pipes that we have without having to go over the internet to connect between those two virtual networks. So another huge powerful add in respect to how virtual networking technology within Azure can enhance the capabilities of your customers now and their flexibility and what they can do. It's a lot of different respects to virtual networks, a lot of different topologies that are available now. So what about how you actually get your virtual network started? And at this point, we're talking about what needs to be in place on your premises, or your customer's premises, of course. And that's actually some type of gateway. Some type of VPN device. And you'll notice on this slide we have the ones that are currently supported, and I believe a few more have actually come to the table. But on the left-hand side we've got Cisco and Juniper. The nice thing about both Cisco and Juniper is that we actually can provide the actual script to enable those gateways to connect up into the virtual network, and I'll demonstrate and show what that looks like. We also do provide the script for Windows Server 2012, and that's the RAS server. So that's big right there. Many of our SMB customers may not have some of these other devices, but they have a Windows Server running on premises. They can now utilize RAS within that infrastructure to be that connecting gateway. We do also support these other options on here, Citrix, F5, WatchGuard, and I believe a few more at this point. We don't provide scripts for those as of yet, but I would expect to stay tuned as that type of resource becomes available. They will become available. Right now, we give you the instructions on how to set those up. There's clear TechNet articles on how to set those up. But at the end of the day, Generic VPN devices, even outside of these, must support some just basic items that most VPNs will support. IKE 1 and 2, of course, AES 128 and 256, as well as SHA 1 and 2. Those encryption technologies and technologies that involve around the IPsec arena are what are required in order to get this set up and running.
Yeah, and I've had a partner that got this working with Sonic Walls. A lot of you might be using Sonic Walls. It's not listed in our documentation, but it supports IPsec tunneling. They got it working, right? And if you do a search for it, chances are you'll find some good guidance out there on Bing to get that set up.
So moving on, talking about virtual networks, now let's talk about the virtual machines. All of this encompasses, of course, the infrastructure as a service within Azure. Virtual machines. Everybody's probably familiar with virtualization technologies. Many of us are using Hyper-V or even competitive virtualization technologies in place today. This basically takes that same type of technology, and it is Hyper-V based, but puts it within data centers that Microsoft manages. And these are large, very protected, very isolated, secure data centers that Microsoft has built out across the world, thus allowing you a lot of flexibility on the ability to make sure that these sessions are always connected, that they're always available. There's an SLA associated, which I'll get into momentarily. But that's the ability to scale across the board on these types of virtual machines and these servers and these applications that you may be running up there beyond what any SMB customer can really do on their own today, if you think about it. If you have one virtual machine or you have 10 virtual machines, whatever it may be, they can scale up and scale down based on the demand using the auto-scaling technology that's built into the Azure infrastructure. There's quite a long list, and it continues to grow, of Microsoft-supported workloads. If you do a search on TechNet for supported workloads on Azure, I expect you would find the TechNet article that talks about all the different workloads. And some of the more recent ones, GP was just announced as being supported. SharePoint is a large and a popular one that many customers will use. Yes, we have SharePoint Online, and that does fit the bill for many of the customers, but I believe even Mike mentioned during the first session, there are scenarios where they've got a SharePoint infrastructure on premises today, and they've done a lot of customization, a lot of low-level customization where you need to install things down at the DLL, the low level of that, that SharePoint server. You can use and put it in the cloud using Azure infrastructure as a service. I talked about the networking connections, and that, of course, is secure across the board. And when you do that virtual networking, of course, you can actually make it so the domain infrastructure is actually shared between the two. And if the scenario is right, you can actually displace the domain infrastructure in Azure itself. That is another supported workload, as well as Active Directory Federation services, which was talked about in some of the previous sessions. Now, what do you use to manage this infrastructure? There's a web-based console, which I'll be demonstrating quite a bit today. But there is also other tools that are available. Of course, System Center. You can use, if you're a System Center user, you can utilize components within System Center to manage these virtual machines. And you can use components in System Center to move virtual machines from on-premises into the cloud and back and forth. And I'll talk about that a little bit more momentarily. And then, of course, Azure is not just, this infrastructure. This has come to play within the last year and a half that it's really come full swing and come to where it is now. But Azure's been around for some time with all the various other services that are associated with it. But of course, these Azure virtual machines, these servers that you set up, can take advantage of services running within other aspects of Azure. Be it, of course, Azure Active Directory. We could be talking about serving and helping with websites. We could be talking about the SQL aspect of it and interacting with Azure SQL and pulling data from there and utilizing it. So it can all be part of a team, part of a complete solution that can come to play utilizing all these tools. Notice too, I haven't mentioned it yet, but if you look on that virtual machine cloud shot there, you see Windows Server, but you also see Linux. Linux is a fully supported, many flavors of Linux are fully supported within the Azure, and there's an entire open source community, which I'll talk about in just a moment. Actually, I'm going to talk about that right now. So, I mean, Azure is, from an open source community, we support a variety of Linux platforms, Red Hat, Ubuntu, and a few others that are available. And also many others will build out images and make them available on this open source VM depot, as you can see here. This is a gallery of open source Linux images that the community will upload to and manage, but it's totally integrated with the Azure Management Portal, meaning that you can actually pull it into your storage area and then spin up a VM based on it. A good example of this, my son is an avid Minecraft fan, and somebody had posted an Ubuntu image running a Minecraft server. So I had, in a matter of 10, 15 minutes, had an Ubuntu Minecraft server up and running that he was able to actually work with and start playing with using that Minecraft infrastructure. Quite cool. This slide really just shows what it looks like when it's integrated into the console. You can see you can choose the actual image that you're going to use, and then just go to the next steps to actually spin it up. And I'll actually demonstrate, not with open source, but with how this works across the board. So another aspect of the virtual machines, and Azure in general, is storage, right? So in respect to virtual machines, storage is being utilized within the Azure infrastructure. When you initially spin up a virtual machine, what will happen is that initial image is going to create it on a hard drive within our data center. But if you saw that image, the green hard drives, there's a few others that spun up, 2 others. There's now 3. What that means is there's a persistent image of your virtual machine in its current state replicated across 3 separate hard drives, completely separate from each other in that data center. So this helps ensure that the stability and the availability of that virtual machine will be there based on if a hard drive were to happen to fail, it would just replicate onto another hard drive within that particular area of the data center, and you would actually just continue to work. But we actually go to the next step. You may saw the title of this slide is geo-replication. And we're talking about multiple geographies. So not only do you have the 3 within that initial data center where you set up, say for example on the west, it'll actually duplicate it 3 more times to another data center within the region, in this case an east data center. So there are actually going to be 6 copies of your virtual machine at any one time. And these are persistent, meaning they're all going to be near real-time replicated with very minimal loss of data. If one of them were to crash, you will be up and running and continue to running where you were due to that geo-replication. And this isn't the case just with Azure Virtual Machines, by the way. This is the case with how Azure Storage works, blob storage and other storage aspects of Azure. Geo-replication. You can choose local replication at a slightly lower cost. But the default is geo-replication, and I would definitely recommend geo-replication because that ensures the viability of your data.
So Todd, this is impressive replication. Do customers and partners have access to these replicated copies, or is it kind of a behind the scenes sort of thing?
Good question. This is actually behind the scenes. This is stuff that our technology is taking care of. While this is infrastructure as a service, and you do have to do a lot more as far as management of it because the actual operating system you're in full control over, that actual aspect of it is something that our folks will manage within our data centers, and you do not have to worry about it. It's all done automated. There's a lot of flexibility and portability between this infrastructure because these VMs are based on VHDs. They're based on Hyper-V technology. So if you've got a VHD within your data center, it's not that difficult. Just upload it into Azure and use it there, or vice versa. The same goes if you're using other third-party hosting environments, other service providers. They can move back and forth wherever they need to be, wherever it makes the most sense. Because of that being that same native technology, that same Hyper-V technology enables this functionality. And this is something that Microsoft has that many other vendors do not have in this space. We have the ability to move in between a variety of implementation types using the same VHD, the same virtualization technology. Going to the next step along those same lines, but the next step, What about competitive scenarios? You've got a customer that's heavy users of VMware. They can actually use the same technology as well, because within the Hyper-V environment, there are tools available either as part of the Hyper-V management infrastructure, or you can download even the converter tool that will convert a VMware image, a hypervisor image, into a Hyper-V hypervisor image. Into a VHD, and then upload that, and then you would just upload that via PowerShell into the Azure infrastructure and be able to start using that. So keep in mind, you're not locked out of it just because you're using a third party, another vendor's tools. You can actually potentially take advantage of Azure here as well. Now, a few other terms that are very, very important in respect to virtual machines and networking, this kind of starts combining the two, is the idea of availability sets. Availability sets are a key part if an SLA is important to you, that service level agreement. We offer a 99.95% uptime, guaranteed uptime of a virtual machine. But in order to get that, it does need to be part of an availability set. And it really makes sense if you think about it. We do not manage the underlying OS. The customer or you on their behalf manages that underlying OS. So we don't know what's happening in it. So to ensure that at least one of them is up at any one time, there needs to be a duplicate of it running. And what an availability set does is puts them in something called different fault domains or different update domains. Meaning that if one of those domains and one of those areas of the data center has an outage, the other one would actually take over. It would become the primary. And same with updates. If an update were to hit, we're never going to send updates down to the entire data center at the same time. It'll be broken out into different fault domains. So this basically enables the ability to ensure availability during updates, during maintenance, during potential outages as well. And make sure that it helps make sure that those virtual machines are available at that SLA guaranteed time frame.
So let me see if I have this straight and position it another way. Todd spent a lot of time earlier talking about the replication and geo-replication. And a lot of you might think, well, if I'm getting replicated to all these different sites, right, why do I need availability sets? It's getting replicated. But there's the chance that because it's a virtual machine where the customer, the partner is managing the operating system, if that OS gets corrupted, guess what gets replicated, right? The corrupted OS, so your copies aren't much good to you. So I think that's why availability sets are important. Would you agree with that?
Definitely having a separate, because it is a separate virtual machine running. That's just to just to make sure that the availability of the initial one is going to be available.
Okay.
Another term that's very important in terms of virtual networking and virtual machines is affinity groups. And affinity groups really has to do with where your actual infrastructure is located. Because if it's just a single virtual machine or a few virtual machines, it may not be quite as important. But when you start having a virtual network within Azure that have quite a few different workloads going on and quite a few different activities, multiple AD servers or application servers running up there, you want to make sure that they're located physically close to each other within that data center. And that's what an affinity group does. It makes sure that, that all of those different things, all these different tools are closely located. Compute, network, and storage resources. So this isn't just the infrastructure, this is also storage, making sure that the actual storage hardware is close. This will help give you better performance across the board, and it will also lower latency between machines within the infrastructure. Because our data centers are quite large and quite expansive. So you can have one in one place, and potentially if you weren't using affinity groups, there could be one hundreds and hundreds of yards away. But if they're relatively close to each other, that'll help ensure that lower latency. And then lastly, it'll help reduce egress costs. Mike talked about some of the costs during the initial session. One place where there is another charge in terms of Azure services is the egress, the data output from your virtual machines to some endpoint. Ingress is not, but egress is. If these machines are closer to each other, and they, especially if they're close to each other and not in separate data centers, you would obviously not be incurred additional egress costs in those types of scenarios. So this is kind of a high-level summary of virtual machines and virtual networks. Just knowing that you've got this scalable on-demand infrastructure that is available for your customers' applications. It could be of any types of applications. And when I talk about applications, they could be even things like QuickBooks. I've got many partners that are implementing QuickBooks, upgrading customers' servers into the Azure infrastructure on various lines of business applications. But the nice thing is now they don't have to worry about the hardware that could be sitting on a corner. They don't have to worry about the network connection that they have to ensure accessibility to it, because it's all taken care of within the Microsoft architecture within our data centers. We talked about how this could be both Windows Server and Linux-based platforms. And no app changes, it's same VHD infrastructure. Now, we talk about running applications, but another place where the people will use, and many of my partners are using Azure infrastructure today, is even just for testing. Maybe they're not, customers not at a point in time where they want to actually implement in production within Azure, but you're working on applications for them. Instead of having to have you as a partner spin up a server on premises within your environment, so that means you need the hardware and everything associated with that, the operating system and everything. You actually would have that within the Azure infrastructure. You can actually test applications and then potentially roll them out on premises, wherever that may be, right? But being able to use this as test. And I think it was mentioned in one of the earlier sessions too, if you've got an MSDN account, you can actually spin up you can actually spin up a Windows client, Windows 7 or Windows 8.1 workstation within Azure. And that's something that was recently announced as TechEd as being available and is available now. So if you're a partner who has MSDN access and has an MSDN account, make sure you set up your Azure account connected with that to be able to access that capability, because now you can actually test things on the client. And then when you're done testing, you just turn it off, shut it down, or even destroy it based on whatever you're using for it, and spin up another one as needed. So there's a lot of flexibility in that respect.
And remember what I said regarding this subject in session 1, a test resource, you turn it off, you don't pay for it, right? So that's always something to consider when you are using testing VMs. Turn them off during off hours, off peak, or when you're not working on a project. A lot of cost savings.
Indeed, definitely. So the next thing I'm going to go over is kind of a pseudo whiteboard session to make sure I've talked about a lot of different terms, and there's a few other terms I want to make sure everybody hears before we go into the demonstration. So the next few graphics actually kind of lay out the land, lay out the potential topology. So we talked about the affinity group. This is ensuring that all of these, all this infrastructure, be it the networking, be it the virtual machines, be it the storage, is all within the same area of a data center. Make sure they're all close to each other to reduce those latency times and costs. Now you could have one virtual network within an affinity group, but as this graphic shows, you could actually have two. You can have many virtual networks that are isolated from each other within an affinity group based on the needs of that particular scenario. So within these virtual networks, you're going to have one virtual machine or multiple virtual machines. In this case, you'll see you've got some groupings of virtual machines within each virtual network, but then a few of them are going to be broken out into individual availability sets, because these are machines that you need to be up and running and available at all times, sticking with the service level agreement that we offer, and they're producing some type of application that needs to be available. This will ensure that they are actually available. Now, another term we haven't mentioned yet is a cloud service. Cloud service kind of is an overarching way of actually accessing all of these tools within this infrastructure. It's a single point of entry into virtual machines. And when I say single point of entry, I'm talking about the DNS name or the IP address to access into these virtual machines. That's essentially what a cloud service is. You're not required to go through it, by the way, which I'll talk about. You can actually, if you set up a closed network, you can actually connect to your virtual machines, and it's actually connecting to your own network. You can connect to it via normal RDP channels and turn this off from each individual virtual machine, so kind of for security purposes. But that is essentially what the cloud service. You'll see the cloud service term also in websites. It's the same idea. It also helps and is required actually to set up any type of load balancing scenarios. You need to implement the cloud service. A few quick items, virtual network to virtual network. I talked about how that functionality was added recently announced at the last TechEd. So you can actually have those two connecting to each other, and along the same lines, you could actually also have multiple site-to-site IPsec tunnels from an individual virtual network. And this is just layering on top of what I already talked about earlier in respect to virtual networking. So with that, I'm actually going to transition over to a demonstration where I'm going to show virtual networks. I'm going to go through the screens, talk about how to set one up, and then show one that's currently active so you can get an idea of what it looks like when it's actually in an activity, and then also show a little bit about spinning up virtual machines, the different options that are available. So I've logged into my Azure portal. This is the Azure management portal, manage.windowsazure.com. And a few things to note first. You'll see there's quite a few things going on within the portal that you see here. And that's first off, I'm on the All Items tab on the left-hand side. I believe Mike showed this earlier, but you can actually filter on what you're looking at within your Azure portal. So as a partner, these different demo accounts, you can think of them as different customers, so they can be isolated from each other. And you can also have access to only the ones and filter on the ones that you happen to be working on, so you do not get confused by what you're working on. You know you're working on your that particular customer's Azure environment. So when you start talking about networks, the first thing that you may want to do, that you can do as an option, is actually even setting up an affinity group. You can do this now, or you can do this when you're initially setting up the virtual network. I like to show everything just so people understand. Just like a lot of things we do at Microsoft, there's a lot of different ways to get things done. But you'll notice under settings, I can look at and see the different affinity groups that have already been created as part of these two different subscriptions, my own subscription and my team's demo subscription here. I could create a new one right here if I wanted to, and go through and actually select the name of it, put which subscription, what region I want that particular one to be. And I'll go ahead and do that. I'll call it delete this. One thing you'll notice too, and I definitely recommend from a naming conventions, when you are actually naming the different components within Azure, it's a good idea to have a common naming convention, so when you look at different aspects and look at the names of things, you know what they're referring to. And I like to adhere to the idea of what a lot of programmers will actually do, and use a couple of lowercase letters at the beginning of the names of things to basically be the acronym. So in this case, you'll see I name this AG for Affinity Group, delete this. So I'll know whenever I see this particular item, I know it's an affinity group, and I named it delete this because I plan on deleting it post the demonstration. Whenever you create anything, you'll notice on the bottom part of the Azure management infrastructure, it'll let you know that something's going on. And if this icon down here is showing with movement, you'll know there's some active process going on at any one time. Now we're going to go up and actually look at the networks item within Azure. So this is a listing of the networks that are already been created within my two subscriptions. The demo one, I'm going to actually show this in a few moments. This is one that's actually active and running for demonstration purposes, and I'll talk about that when we get to that. But what I'm going to go through first is actually creating a virtual network. And in creating anything in Azure, what you're going to do initially, always, you'll notice on the lower left-hand corner is a big plus sign in the new. That's where you're going to start creating any particular function, every particular workload that you're working with Azure. It will shortcut to the section that you're in when you initially press it. You'll notice it went to Virtual Network. I've got a few different options here. I've got Quick Create. I would say use Quick Create if you want to create a virtual network that's going to be purely just a virtual network. You're not going to be creating a gateway. It's really more for just testing reasons, I would say. As you can see, there's not a lot of flexibility on the different aspects of it that you can work with. You can obviously give it the name. You can choose from the different private address spaces that you'll be utilizing and what the maximum count may be, where of course it's going to be located. And any DNS servers that you may already have created, that will be available, and of course what subscription you're going to assign it to. For purposes of this, I'm going to go to Custom, and this is where you get a lot more control over what you're going to be doing and how you're going to be actually configuring your network. So I'm going to go ahead and give it a name of VM VN delete this. I'll choose what location. The location can be important. You want to make sure you're putting it in a particular region that is going to be conducive to what the project is we're working on and where your potential customers are and where their environments are. I'll go ahead and choose East here. And then you choose which subscription in this case. If I was filtered to just one, I would only see one. I've filtered down to two, so I have a few here. I'm going to go ahead and choose my own. Go to the next screen. This is where you can actually set up the DNS server. As noted here, and I think I mentioned it earlier, this setting is actually optional. You can add this, and this is something you can add later. Now, I'll point out a few things too. Not everything you can add later. Some things you can't change later. But this is one thing that you can change later. Or you can add now. For example, since I know that I've got a DNS server already, it's going to be configured as part of this Active Directory infrastructure that this is going to participate in, I can just call it ADDNS2. I'll make it different than the other one, and give it an IP address, 168.0.4.3. Now on the right-hand side, you'll see I've got a couple different options here. I can choose whether to be a point-to-site connectivity, and I'm creating that VPN, or it can be the site-to-site connectivity. Do note, I showed it a second ago with DNS. If you put your cursor over this little question mark, you can get a little more information on that, and there will also always be links to even further information about these different options. In this demo, I'm going to go ahead and select Configure a Site-to-Site VPN. And at this point, it knows that I'm actually going to be configuring. And one thing, too, I haven't mentioned, but if you look on the bottom part of the screen, as I'm building out this topology, it's actually giving me a visual network preview, showing me graphically what that network is going to look like. My network, on my virtual network, what the VPN is going to connect to, any DNS servers. So follow that along as we go through and complete this. Another item you'll see here called Express Route. This is something that just went global availability, I believe, so it's now available. This may not be something that a huge amount of our SMB partners will be playing with or working with, but there may be some cases where it would make sense. And what it really means is you can now actually purchase a dedicated pipe between Azure and your local infrastructure using services such as AT&T and some other telco services that'll actually manage that pipe. So instead of having to use the internet and rely on the internet as the connection between the 2 points, you can actually have probably a pipe that you're paying for, and you've got an SLA associated with it and a guaranteed amount of rate between the two. So if it's something that's going to be a much more intensive type of application and functionality put into this infrastructure, that may be something you want to use. Then you can decide whether you're going to use one of the local networks you've already configured, and I'm going to actually say specify a new local network because I'm going to go through the screen to actually configure that new local network. So this is the next part when you're configuring that site-to-site connectivity. You're going to need to give the virtual network a name, actually this is going to be the name of your on-premises site, so I like to start with site-to-site. Delete this. Now this VPN address, this is important. 122 or 33.44.22. This actually needs to be the IP address of your local router. This is not something that can be NATed. It has to be the actual internet exposed IP address of your local router. This is what it's going to connect to get back to your on-premises infrastructure. So it's very important that it has to be public facing and it can't be located behind any type of NAT system. And then you can actually set up your address space. What your address space is going to be. And actually, this is what your address space is on your on-premises infrastructure. So 0.0, and then whatever the address count may be for that. And you can, if there's sub-address spaces that you want to do, the important thing for this is this has to do with making sure that our router that's connecting back knows how to route down to your on-premises network. It knows what IP addresses to route down to that network. At this point, this is where you actually set up the actual virtual network address spaces. And it's important to note that you can set up as many subnets as you want. But important to note also that this is flat. So from an infrastructure point of view, it's all flat. It's more for management reasons and how you want to work with it, so you understand what each of these are. For example, say this is the front end. I'll make this one 1. Missing dot there. Go to add another subnet. Make this the back end. Make this 0.2.0. Actually, one item I meant to change up here. I'm going to delete this. Note that these addresses are free, so you can have as many as you need. For purposes of this, we'll just go with 24. Then I'll add that next subnet to make sure that it all flows correctly. In this case, I'll make this one 2. Add another subnet, make it the DNS subnet. Make this one 3. So these are just examples of how I set up the actual network within this virtual network. The last thing you're going to need to do is actually add the gateway subnet. You do that just by pressing Add Gateway Subnet. That's not something you're going to have control over as far as what the actual IP addresses is. You'll notice that it gives it 8 addresses. What's actually happening on the background, we deduce, is that there are actually virtual machines created running Windows Server RaaS servers when that gateway gets created, and they're assigned within this address space. At this point, I've done everything I need to do to actually have a virtual network and get started. If I click that check mark, it's going to go through the process and start creating that virtual network. You'll see in the information bar, I created an Affinity group earlier. I'll clear that, and it's actually showing that that virtual network is now being created. While it's being created, let's go into and actually look at an established virtual network to see what it looks like. So when you click on it, on the virtual network, and you know what, I'm going to point out real quick, when you're within this user interface, you'll notice that you can click through the different items on a list at any one time. When you click over here on the right-hand side, under Status, Subscription, Location, you can just select them. But when you do click over here under the blue, that's when you're actually going to select a particular item and actually start working and getting under the details of that particular workload, in this case, the virtual network. So if I go over to the dashboard, you'll see here I've got this virtual network set up. I have a colleague that built out an on-premises infrastructure in his basement that's using Windows Server on the back end. Running on our RaaS server, and that's what we're connecting into. It gives you the IP address of that gateway IP address, as well as the data in and the data out at that particular moment, how much traffic. It'll also show all the different resources that are available associated with that, meaning these are all different virtual machines that are participating within this virtual network. So these are very important things. I can go to Configure at this point. And if I go to Configure, you can see the various DNS servers that are set up for this virtual network. I can now actually add point-to-site connectivity. By the way, you can also add multi-site to site or VNet to VNet. Currently, those need to be done through PowerShell, not through the UI, but they can be set up through the PowerShell as well. And then you can look at your how the network is set up and potentially add other subnets if necessary at this time. Under the Certificates tab, this is in respect to point-to-site VPNs. When you set up a point-to-site VPN, you would have to also set up your certificates because that's how we're going to know who the users are who are connecting into it. So you would actually upload a certificate into this tool, and it will generate that VPN client. Going back to the dashboard, a few things I want to point out on the right-hand side here. You'll notice probably the most important one, download VPN's device script. You notice I did start creating a network right before. When you do that, even after it's done creating, and let's see, it looks like it may be done creating. It's actually available here. The gateway has not been created yet. And note, you do not start getting charged for that type of connection until that gateway is created and connected. Because I mentioned earlier, you can have a virtual network without any type of connection down to an on-premises infrastructure. But once you enable that gateway, which if I clicked on Create Gateway here, it would actually start creating that gateway, which is when it will create that RaaS server within our data centers for you to connect to. The reason I'm pointing this out right now is you'll see this download VPN device script is here. Don't suggest that you actually utilize it yet. You want to actually utilize the device script after the gateway has been connected, and I'll show you why. If I go back to the actual one that's completed already, if I click on download a VPN device script, This is that dialog, and I talked about this earlier, how we will generate that script. I can choose which vendor. Like I said, there's a few that we currently support that will generate the script for. They can choose the different platforms that we have the script for, as well as the operating system. Do note, too, we support both dynamic and static routing. So depending on the type of device it is, we would support either one. I want to choose the Microsoft. It'll actually choose our RAS and operating system of 2012 R2. If I click the checkbox there, it's actually going to download that script. What I'm going to do right now is actually show you what that script looks like, just so you understand what is being generated in respect to this, and reason why you wanted to wait till after the gateway is fully completed. There's a lot of PowerShell information here. What a lot of it's going to do here. The one thing it's going to do for you, if you haven't implemented the RAS role on that server, it's actually going to implement and start the RAS as well as the site-to-site VPN infrastructure. This is important right here. It's actually going to place the IP address of the gateway within our environment onto your local gateway machine, router device. And that's why you want to wait till you have this script after the gateway is fully, otherwise we wouldn't have that IP address. And then it's actually going to start the dial-in service, the RAS service, and actually dial into the Azure gateway. It'll actually start the connection all from, in this respect, the RAS script. So you can see how it can save you a lot of time. And we do know a lot of people don't like running foreign scripts against their routers, so it's not required, but at least even with the Cisco and the Juniper, you can actually at least look at it and understand what it's doing, what different settings are being set, and if you wanted to, after looking at it and reviewing it, running it yourself, you can, or you can go through and manually run through those steps yourself. With that, I think I'm actually going to move over to virtual machines. We've talked a lot about virtual networks at this point, and you've seen a virtual network and what it looks like in a running scenario. And if you saw session one, you saw it actually in use using our RDP demo scenario, remote desktop and remote app demo scenario. So what are the next point is going to be actually starting and creating virtual machines. So I'm going to go into this environment onto my Azure management infrastructure. And again, you see all the different options here. If you go towards the top, that's where virtual machines are going to be. Under virtual machines, you're going to have quite a few different options. You're going to see first the instances of all the machines that you've got running. Do note you're going to see some instances in my environment that show as stopped or deallocated. This is very, very important, and this is something I want to make sure everybody understands. If you've got a running virtual machine and you're logged into the virtual machine via RDP, and you choose to shut down that virtual machine just via that RDP session, just through the normal Windows shutdown, it's still going to be showing as running in here. What its reason for that is actually still utilizing an IP address. As long as a virtual machine is utilizing an IP address, it is actually costing you money or costing the customer money. So if you're doing testing or you're doing things that doesn't need to be up at any particular time, you can save money by actually stopping it. And you would stopping it by clicking on shut down here on this user interface. So if I click on shut down, I'm not going to do it because I need to use that machine, but if I click shut down, it'll shut it down, put it into stopped, and as long as it's in stopped deallocated state, you know that you're not being charged for any of the processes within that virtual machine, and you don't have to worry about it. On this UI as well, you can see what subscription, where the particular virtual machines are located, and what the DNS is, what that DNS name is. And we'll talk about that more in a minute. Across the top too, you'll see images. This is where you can actually upload an image that you create, because of course, and I'm going to show you in a moment a lot of the images that are available right within this infrastructure. But if you have your own custom image, be it a Windows Server or other platform image that you've created, you can upload it into Azure, into this infrastructure, and utilize it. If it's a Windows Server image, make sure, of course, that you sysprep it. And another tip, make sure that you enable remote desktop services on it. If you forget to enable remote desktop services, you're not going to be able to connect to it and manage it in any shape or form. So definitely recommend doing that. You'll notice I've got one here that I talked about earlier, that I've got a Minecraft image up here and also have a Windows Server 2003 R2. Real quick note on that. Windows 2003 is not officially supported on Azure, but if you create your own image and you want to test things, we have had success getting it to work. And also all of the associated disks that you have set up with all your various images will be available, and you can actually see them here. So let's go through the steps of actually setting up a new virtual machine. Once again, you click on New, go to Virtual Machine. You've got two options as before. You've got Quick Create. Again, like before, if you just need to quickly spin up an image to do some testing, it's going to be in its own, have its own temporary use function, or you just want to start learning how it works, I definitely recommend you doing that here. You set up the DNS name, which you'll notice our DNS names will always end in cloudapp.net. That's the Azure infrastructure. You choose the type of image that you want to utilize. I'll talk about this more in a moment, as well as the size options. You do have to put in a username, password, and it has to be a strong password. And then, of course, what region, or if you already have an Affinity group set up, what Affinity group and subscription. I'm going to go through and actually go from gallery, because you do get a lot more flexibility when doing it from the gallery. So right here I've got a list of quite a few, and these continues to increase, of different images that are pre-built. If you're running Windows Server, if you're using one of these images, by the way, your license, that license that the minutes or the usage of that server also includes CALs. So that's an important note I like to make sure I mention. You'll see there's quite a few pre-built images up here. Windows Server Essentials Experience. Many may not know that Windows Server Essentials can actually be enabled in Data Center, and that's what this is. This is a Data Center server with the Essentials Experience enabled. So if you're not familiar with Essentials and what it brings to the table, you can start utilizing it with this image here, as well as 2008 R2 SP1. And then you start going down, you see this is a long list. You can filter easily on the left-hand side. I can choose just to show SharePoint, and it's got already a 2013 trial image up there, same with various SQL type environments, BizTalk, as well as the third-party Linux images, Ubuntu, CentOS, SUSE, all available here. You'll see my images, so as you saw, my image that I had in the previous screen is available here, as well as any disks. You'll note too that this account isn't an MSDN account. If it was, I could check that box and then see the Windows clients as well. I'm going to go back up to all and choose the Windows Server Essentials Experience. This is where you can choose the version release date, and this may confuse people sometimes, but what it really just is a date of that build based on the updates that were available at that time. So if you've got a scenario where you need to test something against an image that's from an update that didn't have any newer updates since last January, you can choose that particular one. So it's a way of easily testing previous updates. You have to give the virtual machine a name, of course. My old favorite, delete this. What tier it's going to be, and when I say tier, there's two different levels within virtual machine pricing. There's basic and standard. The biggest difference with basic is you're not going to be able to take advantage of load balancing and some of the more advanced functionality. They came out with basic to provide a lower cost solution for people that don't need those functionalities or just need to spin up machines for tests, and they didn't want to spend the higher cost. Under either one, you're going to have a variety of options as far as the size. Starting out with a shared core, which definitely I would only suggest for testing because it is what it actually says. You're sharing a core with other machines. But if you want to start having a dedicated core, you can go from 1 core up to 4 or up to 8 cores with the basic. Standard, they've actually released recently all the way up to 16 cores, 112 gigabytes of memory. So there's a lot of flexibility. Now do note too, whatever you select here initially, you can change. You're not locked into this, and I'll show you that momentarily. Let me give it a name and password. Go to the next screen. This is a place where you have definitely, it could be confusing. You have a lot of flexibility because there's a lot of different controls here. I can see I can create a new cloud service. That container I talked about, where lots of virtual machines can exist under one access point via IP address, and that's where you can enable that load balancing functionality. and it would actually give it the name based on whatever you've already selected. But if I choose a cloud service that already existed, you'll see settings start to change. Things will be locked out because other settings are already part of those predetermined cloud services, such as, let me go to DCs here. It'll show that I'm actually, this is under a certain subscription, this is under already set up with a certain affinity group and virtual network, but now I can actually choose the subnet that that particular one is going to be part of. And then choose a storage account or use an automatically generated storage account. I would recommend creating storage accounts because the storage account names that are automatically generated can be quite long and confusing. Again, from a file naming standpoint or just naming standpoint in general, it's definitely good to have a consistent name. And also if you want to set it up in an availability set. I'm going to go back for this one to create a new cloud service. I'm going to put it in my account. We'll choose East US. And then on the lower part here, you'll see there's a few options for endpoints. And I talked a little bit about the cloud service. The endpoints is how that particular virtual machine can be accessed. And by default, there's two endpoints that are always created. The remote desktop endpoint, which will have its private port, which everybody's probably familiar with, 3389. You can change it if need be. But you notice that the public port will be automatically generated. And it's because it's going to create a different public port for each virtual machine that's under that same cloud service when you start having multiple machines under the same cloud service. PowerShell, same thing. I can actually add other and create other services, such if I wanted to do SSH. So you can create other endpoints as needed. And this is not something you need to do now, but you can definitely do it now. You can also do it as the machine's being spun up. At this point, this is the last screen. One option is to install a VM agent. VM agent is actually used to manage extensions and additional functionality that can be enabled. One of the current extensions that is available that I definitely would recommend installing the VM agent has to do with passwords. If you forget a password, which in the early days, like other things, if you forget a password on a VM, you weren't able to get back into it without spinning up another one. Now there's actually some PowerShell with this VM agent technology. You can actually use PowerShell commands to actually create or reset the password. There's some other extensions here, configuration, if you're doing development and scripting against it. There's some third-party scripting tools that have pre-built extensions, as well as some security extensions. If you're already an endpoint protection customer from Symantec or Trend customer, or want to use Microsoft anti-malware on that server, you can actually enable it now right away. You do have to be licensed, of course, for Symantec or Trend. The Microsoft one is currently in preview, but if you are, this will actually have it already part of that image. So once I click on the check mark, it's going to start actually spinning up that virtual machine, right? And it'll actually spin it up. You know, it's not going to take a long amount of time to spin up these virtual machines. It could take 5 or 10 minutes based on what's going on. You can see it's down here at the bottom, and it's starting up. Right now, while that's spinning up, I'm actually going to go through and show what a virtual machine looks like that's been running for some time, so you can get an idea of some of the other options from a management standpoint. If you go under the dashboard, you can actually see kind of a perf monitor light where you can actually get access and see the status of various aspects of the server itself, the CPU percentage, the network bandwidth going on, the disk read writes, and things like that. You can set up auto scaling. We're not going into that today, but if you have an availability set, you can actually set it up to auto scale where it can go up or go down in power of the machine, or even shut down based on time. There's a variety of settings that you can do there. You'll notice that it'll tell you how many cores are running within this virtual machine and how many cores you have. You'll note that it actually says 20 cores. By default, every tenant is allocated 20 cores for virtual machines. If you do need more, you just need to call into support and request more. If you're using a lot of high-power machines, you can get more cores. It's just a way to help control abuse of the infrastructure. And then I'll show the various disks. And one thing you'll notice is there's a data disk here. You can add external, or not external, separate data disks to your infrastructure. You're always going to have an OS disk associated with a virtual machine, but say you want to have a separate disk to store data, such as you're not going to want to run your AD database on your main OS disk. You would create a separate data disk. You would actually do that by just clicking on Attach down here and Attach Empty Disk, and it'll actually create that particular disk image. And you have a few options here. You can select how large you want it to be. What the cache preference is, which we recommend leaving to none unless you're doing some type of hardcore database. You might need read-write, but like I said, you can click on the question mark and always get more details on what those options mean. But that'll actually add a disk to that infrastructure, and I'll show you what that looks like in the virtual machine. On monitor, you can get into a little bit more with that performance statistics. One nice thing I like is you can actually add metrics to monitor. And then actually go to the next step and actually add a rule. So let's say I want to create a rule that's going to alert me, CPU alert. You can put a description. And now you can say if that CPU gets over 80% at an average over the last 30 minutes, send an email to a service admin, or even send an email to another external administrator. This is a nice way of setting it up so you're being notified if things are occurring that you don't expect to be occurring and you need to bring some attention to it. It's a helpful way to actually manage, of course. You can configure the endpoints as I talked about earlier, manage those here, as well as do some configuration here. This is where you can actually change the virtual machine size if need be. Do note when you change the virtual machine size or the virtual machine tier, it is going to require a reboot. It's going to require a restart of that virtual machine. But if you think about how that could save you a lot of money right now, you can start off low on your requirements instead of starting off, as Mike talked about in the first session, on the high end. You can actually start to manage your money a lot better as far as what the actual costs are of these virtual machines. Do note here too, you cannot change the virtual networking configuration of a virtual machine after it's been created, and that's important. I talked about that earlier. When you create a virtual machine, if you want to add it to that network, you need to do it during that initial setup. And once it's connected to a virtual network, you cannot change that. You can capture an image. So, I mean, if you needed to use this image for something else, you can capture that image, sysprep it, capture it, and reuse it, re-implement it as an image. But you wouldn't be able to do any changes as far as network changes to that particular one. So how would you connect into this server? What you would do is actually, you'll see, if I go back to even all of my virtual machine list, I've got all these different virtual machines here, including the one that is still provisioning here. But this one here shows is running the one that I was showing a moment ago. How would you actually connect to it via RDP? It's as simple as clicking the connect button. You click the connect button, you're actually going to get the prompt for that RDP code that's actually already set up to connect to that server. I'm going to actually save it to my local desktop because I want to show something. I'm going to change the name here real quick. Demo. Click Save. So I could just click Open and it would actually immediately connect me to that server. But I want to highlight a few points in respect to that. I'm going to bring this back up here, go back to the dashboard, go to that one that I just downloaded, right-click and edit. A few items to note. The actual address is that cloud service that we talked about, but you'll notice that the port, that's not your normal port, because that's a port that's going to this specific virtual machine within that cloud service. That way you can have multiple virtual machines using just one public IP address. Do note on addressing too, we did actually announce recently that you can, and this is a slight sidetrack, but I'll make sure I mention it, and you can look into it on TechNet. But we do offer the ability to make a reservation for IP addresses, hold IP addresses now, private IP addresses on virtual machines. That's something that didn't exist before. So back to this, you can see here I can see that that's actually connecting to that particular server. I can go to local resources. Another suggestion or item I like to recommend is that you actually map the drives. And if you select that way your local drives on your local machine will always be available in your Windows File Explorer view. And then you would go through the process of starting to connect to that server. Now I'm actually already connected to this server, so I'm going to go ahead and bring that up here. So this is that server connected via RDP. So this is when we talk about the fact that this is a server that you're managing, just like any of these. You're actually managing this server. If you look at it, you know, this is Windows Server 2012 R2. I've got access to my start screen, access to everything else that may be installed on this particular machine. I can go to the desktop. I can manage all the actual OS level updates. There may be updates pushed from the underlying Hyper-V architecture, hence the reason for those availability sets and to be able to set up update realms. But in respect to the actual machine updates themselves, you would manage it.
So Todd, by default, I just want to make sure I'm clear on this. When you RDP into a server, it wants you to go through the cloud service right from the admin console. But if a customer is security conscious, can they disable external access and just RDP into the port 339?
3389?
Yeah, 3389 through the...
to the machine name?
To the machine name?
They could if they set up a virtual network, and they've got that virtual network connected down into their network, and then they can disable this from a security standpoint. Of course, their VPN is going to have to be up, and that connection is going to have to be up in order for them to connect to it. But at that point, they would connect to it just like if it was on their local network, right? Good question. A few other points I want to show here. I've got a few dialogues up. And these demonstrate a virtual network in usage here. This machine, MSTS2-DC1, is actually not in Azure. This is a machine that's running on premises in my colleague's basement, actually. So you can see you can get that same type of access through that VPN connection, thus enabling the ability to have a network shared between Azure and your on-premises. This I like to show too. Have actually used the ping tool to actually ping a couple of different machines. And you may notice a difference between these two. Look closely at the time of these pings, how long they took. You'll notice the lower one took 1, less than 1 millisecond, very quick. The top one is not taking a long time, but it's 55, 60 milliseconds. The difference between these two, this one is on premises, and this one is actually running in Azure next to this particular virtual machine. So there is going to be a little bit of latency when connecting to an on-premises infrastructure back and forth. Not a huge, but there is going to be some. But that kind of a way of actually illustrating that, and I think that really drives that home. So with that, I believe we're going to jump back to the presentation for a few last comments. Something I don't believe I've mentioned, and shame on me, I meant to mention it earlier, but there's another actionable item coming up within a little over the next year. By the time you see this, maybe less than a year. July 14th, 2015, Windows Server 2003 is going end of support. This is a potential huge opportunity for our partner base out there. To be able to refresh these machines. And why do I bring this up here within this discussion? Because Azure is definitely an option that you now have that you may not have had a couple years ago, right? Many times customers haven't been upgrading these servers because of the cost associated with the hardware and the infrastructure on premises that would need to be updated and so on. Many of these can actually just be moved, that line of business app, whatever it may be that's running on that server, could be moved into the Azure infrastructure as a service. So we wanted to make sure that people start seeing this. You're going to be hearing a lot about this over the next year, of course. Really thought it correlated well when we're talking about Azure virtual networking and virtual machines to make sure that you as partners know that when you have customers in these types of environments, and as you can see here, 50% of Windows servers are still running Windows Server 2003. More than 4 million in the US. That's a huge opportunity, and a lot of that can be moved into Azure. So from a summary point of view, we talked a lot about virtual networking, about how it works, how it can be utilized, all the different types, the site-to-site, point-to-site, and so on. And then talked a lot about virtual machines and the different options that you have available there. Windows virtual machines, Linux virtual machines, how they can participate in networks, both just in the cloud or in concert with networks on premises across the board. Hopefully this was a helpful session to help bring all that, to help clear up a lot of the confusion that you may have, definitely help give an introduction to it. there is a great resource site that's been created called Cloud SureStep for Azure. I would recommend a lot of the things that I talked about today and even more. There's specific links to information on how to spin up a virtual machine from a tutorial standpoint up on the Azure site that would be linked from here. Virtual networking aspects and tools and education across the board. And I would, not just that too, this isn't just a resource for that, but everything about how to do the business, how to utilize Azure. So we definitely recommend visiting aka.ms/SMB Partner Center for that. And with that, I've gone through quite a bit here today. This is probably one of the longer sessions. I've been talking quite a bit. Do you have any comments, anything to add?
No, I learned a lot. You definitely covered quite a bit in the virtual networks, virtual machines. But it looked very straightforward as long as you're familiar with the new terminology Azure introduces, right? And the rules of Azure. So hopefully you got a baseline for those rules and the new terms, and now you can go out, build your own virtual networks first, right? Then build your VMs and have some success. So
I would definitely recommend using your $100 internal use rights. If you haven't implemented that, which in session 1 we talked about how to set those up, get started on that. Or if you have MSDN accounts, get those started. But start playing with it. It's nothing to be afraid of. It's great to start playing with, and once you start utilizing it, the opportunity starts growing.
Well, thanks for joining everybody, and we will see you at our next session.
Yep. Bye-bye.